Okay, welcome to episode 8 of the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager, VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm with Thomas Dimitrov, the CEO of SumerSports. Thomas, you're currently in Colorado, kind of getting ready to get back home. I'm still home in Cincinnati. Thanksgiving, not a part of a team for me as not part of PFF anymore. For you, this is sort of foreign as being a part of the team forever. What's Thanksgiving week been like for you?
Yeah, I've been out here in Colorado. We've had a great time with the kids, spending family time that you cannot do as a general manager in this league through, the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. So I'm taking it all in, man, and I'm enjoying it. We had a great time out in Vail for a couple of days, flying back to Atlanta to celebrate there. Excited to be home.
Yeah, awesome stuff. Well, and again, we're going a little early today just because, life happens. But really excited for all of you that are joining live, whether that be on YouTube or Twitter, or those of you that go ahead and subscribe later on and listen. You can obviously subscribe through iTunes, Spotify. You can watch on YouTube. We just ask that, in all circumstances, rate, review, and subscribe to your favorite platform when appropriate. But, this has been kind of an interesting week, Thomas, because as I look over here at the NFL, there is a division, the AFC West, right, where every single team, Las Vegas goes and gets Devontae Adams. They re-up on Derek Carr. They go and get Chandler Jones from the Arizona Cardinals. The Denver Broncos, who we'll talk about, I think, at length a little bit later, they go and they get Russell Wilson for a big trade, along with Randy Gregory and so on. And then, the Los Angeles Chargers, they go get Khalil Mack, J.C. Jackson. They re-up Mike Williams to go with Keenan Allen. They have Justin Herbert, one of the best quarterbacks in all of football. And yet here before Thanksgiving, the Kansas City Chiefs are 3 games up on the Chargers with a sweep in hand. And it's just, I look and think about these teams, and I think for Vegas and for Denver, the road is going to be long to come back here. But for Los Angeles, I think of the Chargers in a similar vein, right? I think of the Chargers, you hit on an amazing quarterback with the 6th overall pick. And I think you and I both think, I think he's at least an 8 out of 10. Everybody else can think whatever, but he's making almost no money relative to what other quarterbacks of his caliber are making. And yet with him as a starter, the Chargers are 20 wins and 22 losses. They're coming up on the offseason of year 3 for him. He's going to get the max contract, as is Joe Burrow. And I think when you look at having a hard time winning football games when he's making almost no money, what is it going to be like for the Chargers moving forward with a quarterback who's clearly talented, clearly good, but now going to take up a significant fraction of the salary cap? Like, what do the Chargers have to do from here?
Look, let me first start by saying I agree with you 100%. I love the guy. I think he is the elite quarterback, one of the elite quarterbacks in this league, categorically. He's one of those guys, as you know, at 6'6", moving the way he does. He almost looks like he's 6'1.5" at times, right? I love his whole package as far as where he's going mentally and physically and how he can lead the team the way that he does. By the way, one of the best interviews that we had quarterback-wise, even though we shouldn't have really been interviewing him, I mentioned to you last time, everything about him is ideal for that team to grow with. That said, they're not, to your point. I agree, you have to pay him. You must pay this guy. There's no chance in getting a quarterback like that, in my mind, that has that kind of ability over the next while. I don't know how deep into the college side. This team needs to stay with Justin. Of course, they need to pay him the money, and they need to continue to be creative with how they're building the team. Now, look, you can flip this, step back as a GM or a former GM or anyone and say, why are they not producing? Is it a Brandon Staley thing? Is it a coaching staff thing that I have my strong feelings about? There's a lot to do with that, not always just the head coach. So let's go back and forth on this a little bit, because I believe you need to, and I do not believe that they can't win. I just believe that there needs to be some, really stepping back and looking at that organization through and through, how they're led and how they're approaching the talent that they currently have.
Yeah, I firmly agree with you that they have to sign him because I mean we've seen it this week. We'll talk about this in a second. Zach Wilson, one of the more talented strong arms that we've seen come out of college in forever, and we're talking a year and a half in, and he's on the bench, right? The Texans just put Davis Mills, a later round pick, and of those guys, Kyle Trask, Kellen Mond, Davis Mills, the best of the bunch. He's going to the bench because he hasn't been able to produce. Going back to the well for a young quarterback, it is great in theory. But when you're looking at from the Chargers standpoint, where you're already on coach, I believe this is coach number 3 for them over the past decade or so, you have to get results. And the hardest problem, and I think that, when we frame things probabilistically, I do believe it's going to be hard for them because I just think when you look at, the way in which you distribute bets along a roster, the biggest bet is on quarterback, right? All the other bets have to be parlayed together. Your offensive line stays healthy, your coach gels with your personnel, your defense stays healthy and is schemed properly. Your schedule is conducive to good things. And I think the Chargers have gotten unlucky in terms of when they play teams. They played the Niners when they were healthy. They played the Jaguars at the top of the Jaguars market. And so all those lucky things have to happen. And when you have a rookie quarterback on a rookie deal, you can pay for that kind of luck. I always think about when Pat was coming up with Kansas City, they gave Sammy Watkins $16 million a year to be their three, right? And so whereas when Herbert's making $50 million, you have to draft your third wide receiver and hope he comes out. And those are just comes up and does okay. And those are just harder gambles to win with, Thomas.
Well, yes, everything you say was right, spot on. Let me just go back a little bit to the Matt Ryan contract. Again, my own experience and Julio Jones, 2 players making boatloads of money for us in Atlanta, and it got complicated. It will continue to get very complicated for the Chargers when they eventually drop $50 million a year into Justin Herbert. That I get. This keeps coming back to what I'm thinking. I think Tom Telesco is a very good football man, and he knows what he's doing there. He was obviously raised through Bill Polian, right? He has a really strong grasp. I think Brandon Staley, what I love about him, correct me if I'm wrong here, because I know you've been reading a lot more on this. He has a data background, right? At least he wants to approach it with an analytic background. You can expound on that as I understand. We need that in SumerSports, right? We need the GMs and the head coaches who have that bent to thrive. So we're pulling for them, of course, from that standpoint. But again, I think it's vital for Tom Telesco to look at everything within that organization and decide the next direction here. And if that's coaching adjustments, coordinator adjustments, are you aware of the coordinator adjustments over the last few years in LA with the Chargers?
For sure. And to your point, Staley in the game against Kansas City and Los Angeles last year went for 5 fourth downs that a lot of people thought were boundary, and they missed 3 of them. And that was why everybody thought that they lost. On Sunday, he punted on 4th and 1, in his own end. He kicked a field goal at the end of the first half. And I think a lot of the analytics people are like, aha, this is the one game where you were conservative and lost. And so we're kind of even. But when you look at Staley timeout usage, the guy does a good job of preserving his timeouts. Delay of games, they don't get a lot of delay of games. Generally speaking, he does do a good job on 2-point conversion decisions. And for the most part, going into this year, he was doing a great job on 4th down. So I think he's added wins to that team in a way that he's probably a top 8 guy. I think that the issues arise from, what they're doing at the offensive coordinator spot, right? With Joe Lombardi, I think he has an offense. And I'm not saying a lot of times these offenses aren't bad or good. They're just different, right? Joe Lombardi's running a Drew Brees offense for a quarterback who is much more, Carson Palmer and Palmer was a number 1 overall pick. So I don't mean to disparage Herbert. That's a talent, right? He has the arm strength, the kind of high variance that you should be running a high variance offense. And they're running a low variance Drew Brees offense with him. And I think that the one knock I'll have on Herbert again, and on the defensive side of the ball, they've done a good job of implementing the Fangio scheme, but the personnel is still a little off. They're still bad against the run. They still move, they're good in coverage, I think, but bad against the run. And so I just think right now, personnel and scheme for them, the schemes aren't bad, but the personnel doesn't match it quite as well. And I wonder if that just needs to be a thing that changes. And, part of me, from my perspective of quarterback and how quarterbacks have success in this league is I wish Herbert wouldn't go along with it quite as much. You know what I'm saying? I think of quarterback more as a management position than an employee. And so when people are like, well, he's being told to throw these short passes on 3rd and long and stuff, I'm like, I think the next step for Herbert in becoming a quarterback who goes from being really good but can't win to really good and winning is being the scheme, right? Being the scheme the same way that Matt was the scheme for you guys and Pat's the scheme for the Chiefs. And, to a very, very, very high extent, Tom was the scheme. Tom Brady was the scheme in New England. And Peyton Manning was the guy basically running plays for the Colts. Like, I think that's the next evolution, to take a little bit of pressure off the coaching staff and put it on the player who's going to be making $50 million come this offseason.
Look, as a general manager, this is a really, really frustrating thing. And I can only empathize with Tom Telesco on this, with your quarterback that you're building around, with some really good players. I know you argue whether the personnel is matching the scheme, and we could talk about that. That is frustrating. It's a great point. When you're a team builder, i.e. general manager, and you're doing all you can, and remember, Tom Telesco from Bill Polian, very strong personnel driven, right? Meaning we'll bring the damn players in, coaches. You coach them. I'm not saying they don't work together with the coaches, but they have a very strong understanding of what they think are really good football players. And so there needs to be a synchronicity in any organization between the coaches and the personnel department and, of course, the general manager when they're bringing the players together. But if you continue to bring players in that you believe as a general manager are the best talent that you can bring in, then it's up to the coaching staff to get the most out of those players. And I've said to you before, scheme-related, yes. Also substitution, which is the bane of my existence as a general manager. If your coaches aren't substituting correctly, well, that's a whole other one. So this topic, we can talk about it another time as well. In the NFL, when things start to break down a little bit, I'm not suggesting they are with the Chargers, but when they do, between head coach and general manager and what's being brought in and what's not there and what's not thriving, that starts to create this really interesting rift within the organization. And it's up to the leaders, the head coach and the general manager and head coach, to work through that behind closed doors. And lastly, make sure that the coordinators, because the coordinators need to know their spot in this league, they take the lead from the head coach. If the head coach and the GM decide on something, those coordinators better take the lead, because that's the direction that the team needs to go.
Yeah, I think this is so interesting, right? Because I want to hear your opinion on this a lot, because when, I got like kind of a close seat when you were with the Falcons, as far as like looking at kind of, the lower tier players of the roster and the upper tier players of the roster. And it's my estimation, obviously quarterback, is the most important thing, but blue chip players on the roster are just hard to come by, right? Like, if you want to get a Julio Jones, it's going to cost you a lot. Either you have to opt into it, commission, you have to go, or you literally have to get lucky, right? And luck into a guy, like a Stephon Diggs in round 5 or something like that. Tyreek Hill in round 5, a Travis Kelce in round 3. And like, you don't want to have to depend on that, but your roster consists of a quarterback, blue chip players, and then a bunch of guys that are supposed to fit in. And I wonder if it isn't the coach's job to take the blue chip guys and mold the scheme around them. Because for somebody to come to you, Thomas, and say, look, our blue chip players just don't work with our scheme, that to me is a failure of coaching. And whereas the lower tier, that's like your job as an evaluator and a GM to fit the lower tier. Like, you don't want the scheme to depend so much on a lower tier player who doesn't fit the scheme. So maybe there's like 3 tranches of the roster, right? The quarterback, the blue chip players who aren't quarterbacks. And I think that the coaching staff, it's imperative on them for those 2 tranches to do whatever they can to build a scheme that fits those players properly. And then everybody beneath there, it's, evaluators and coaches their job to make sure that those players fit within the scaffolding of the scheme. And I just wonder, because the Chargers have a lot of those ingredients. They have the quarterback, the blue chip players, the Allens and the Williams and the Max and the Derwin Jameses and all those guys. Those are great football players, and it's imperative for the coaching staff to make sure that the scheme enhances what they're doing as explicitly as possible. And then it's the job, I think, of everybody to make sure that the players, maybe from player 16 to 53, all sort of fit in there. And that's a complicated job. And I think as you get a quarterback on $50 million a year, getting those blue chip guys somehow, to me, is the harder part. And that's where I'm a little bearish on the Chargers, only because I've just seen it over and over again where quarterbacks on rookie deals in this league do well. When they get that veteran deal, it's imperative on the decision makers, and this is why SumerSports is so valuable. It's imperative on the decision makers to sort of make sure that they can squeeze the dollars and make sure that middle tier can still be elite and win you a Super Bowl.
So great points. You were calling them blue chip players, and I get that. We often referred to those guys on the team. We always thought that you needed 6 to 8 pillars within your team, right? Offensively and defensively, whether that's, of course, it's quarterback, left tackle, that ideal receiver, the ideal inside backer, the ideal D lineman, and the corner. That pillar area was so vital. You supply the coaching staff with those pillar players, and then starting to get creative with the numbers that you just referred to, 16 or 22 on, or whatever it may be, to make sure that you're fitting. That's why it's important that coaching staffs and personnel staff come together in the offseason, know the scheme as much as possible, stay consistent. I will say this is interesting. You battle this as a GM. Do you want the coordinators that are coming in that are saying, man, just provide me with the players, I'll make it happen? Or do you want the sort of persnickety coordinator? And we've had them both, and I've loved some of them, and others I've had to pull my hair out a little bit, because the ones that think they know everything about evaluating talent, but they might not, they end up being an impediment as far as potentially pulling all the team together, right? There's a happy medium there in my mind, meaning I really believe it can be complicated if and this happened to me before, if a coach says, bring me anyone, after the fact things start going awry and there's a little bit of finger pointing. Well, the GM and his staff didn't bring in the right players for us. That's a little bit of an interesting out.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is such a good topic, because it's like, if you're the Chargers and you've had Phillip Rivers into Justin Herbert for the last, 15 to 20 years almost, you're like, boy, that's a great problem to have. I think most people would say that, but then it's like, there are the difficulties inherent with, kind of, because again, like I think of the very extreme part of it, and we're seeing the very extreme part of it both in New York with the Jets and with the team that the Chargers just played with, Kansas City. Kansas City's out 3 of their top 4 receivers. They have 2 tackles who I think are not great, and a defense that is still figuring it out, and the quarterback and the coach just can overcome it all. And so when you're battling against that every week, it's just got to be frustrating when the smallest things, the smallest unlucky situations for a team like the Chargers just blow up in your face. But you get the other side of it, where the Jets, and this is our next topic here, with Zach Wilson, it kind of doesn't matter. Like, you think about Joe Douglas and the number of things he's done well, right? You trade, Jamal Adams to the the Seahawks, you get 2 first-round picks in return for a safety. That's a great move. You go ahead, and some of the draft picks he's had, Mekhi Becton had a pretty good rookie year. Elijah Vera Tucker was turning into one of the best offensive linemen in all of football. Laken Tomlinson, I don't know if he's had a great year this year, but he was a good free agent signing in my estimation. You look at the wide receivers, Corey Davis, Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, Denzel Mims. And then on the defensive side, Carl Lawson. Quinnen Williams looks like a superstar. John Franklin Myers looks great. Linebacker, you finally get Mosley playing well after a few years of being down and out. And with the 4th pick in the draft, you took maybe the best corner in all of football right now in Ahmad Gardner. And yet the game happens Sunday and it's your quarterback just can't move the football. And it's like you put in all this great work and and the one bet that matters the most is flopping and all the other bets you made are hitting. Like what kind of frustration goes into that for you? And do you think that just a simple change there can turn around the locker room and turn them into winners this week against the Bears?
That is one of the most frustrating things, along with what we were just talking about, for a general manager. I mean, he's put himself on the line. Joe Douglas, again, offspring, so to speak, Baltimore Ravens, Eric DeCosta, and the Ozzie Newsome helped develop a guy like Joe Douglas to be as good as he is. And he is a good evaluator, very good evaluator, and he knows how to put teams together. Then he turns around. Interestingly enough, unfortunately, as a GM, you are really, really graded heavily on your ability to put the right quarterback at the helm. And I've said this, we mentioned in 2 or 3 pods before. You might even had a conversation. I think I heard it on Lindsey Rhodes talking about, the leadership of the quarterback. If you don't have the leadership, I don't care how mobile he is. I don't care how exact he is. I don't care the gun. I mean, we can rip off some of those guys over the years who were really just everything to do, measured out well, physically, literally, and figuratively, but could not lead the team. That is a mistake by that quarterback. For Zach not to own it the other day, there's no doubt that person would have been in my office and we would have been dealing with that along with the head coach. This guy needs to step up and take it on. He needs to take it on because he is accountable. And it frustrates me sometimes because he has the ability to be good, of course. But if you don't have the innate leadership, this is going to be tough. This is going to be a tough travel.
Yeah, we have a good comment here in the live chat here by Mojal. The Jets are in playoff contention doesn't necessarily imply that they're giving up on Wilson in the long term. It doesn't, but it kind of does, though, right, Thomas? Because when you have, the way that the first round pick rookie deal works is that after year 3, you have to decide whether to pick up the player's option, right, the 5th-year option, and so. After year 3, you kind of have to make a choice about the player. And so my thought process, if you're thinking about this from the Jets perspective, is, okay, we can play out the rest of the year. By the way, the Bears have one of the weaker defense in the NFL. In theory, Wilson could have emerged and played better in this game and gotten the spirits up. And they could have done it that way, right? And, they have an easier schedule down the stretch. So, you could have hoped that Wilson had increased the vibes on him down the stretch and all that stuff, and given you, going into 23, given you some optimism about him at the position. Benching him now means that with that roster and the potential that it has, you have to go into next year with a competition at least for that number 1 position for him. And given how good your roster is, all the guys I said, I actually don't think that that's good enough. I think you need to have a real starting quarterback that comes in and plays for the Jets next year, given how tough it is in your division with Buffalo being good, Miami being good, New England's always going to be good with Belichick. So for all intents and purposes, I think this is the door closing on Zach Wilson. And I know that offends our sensibilities because it's like the guy only got 1.5 years to start, but it's the reality of how things work now, isn't it?
It's a reality. It is a reality. And I will segue into a brief discussion about SumerSports. This is the algorithmic puzzle that we are really working on. How are we truly discerning whether that quarterback that we're bringing in for a specific organization not only has all the requisite traits on the field, but the leadership side? How are we truly going to discern that? That is something to me that is fascinating. And we've talked many, many times about that on and off. Look, back to where Zach is and where his development is. It is unfortunate because he's still very young. Very young. I get it. But not for long league. Joe Douglas, as good as I said he is, and a coach that I think is really starting to evolve, and it's fun to watch those guys. I know both coordinators there. They were with us with Atlanta, and I'm pulling for them. I mean, they're both good football men, of course. I'm talking about D coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, and I'm talking about, of course, the offensive coordinator and Mikey LaFleur, right? And those
Yep.
guys are good at what they do. If you don't have a quarterback leading the way, brother, I know this seems like, well, that's just simplifying it. Man, all of a sudden clocks start ticking, seats get hotter, and it becomes a distraction.
Yeah, I think some people always try to galaxy brain this thing and say, "Oh, it's more complicated than that." It's like, no, if your quarterback, and there are levels, and we'll get to a question I think in the questions pre-show where I think it shows the levels. There are levels to this, right? I talk about Mahomes. Mahomes is a nothing matters quarterback, right? He's good no matter what. But then there are levels. I think Zach Wilson's a bad no matter what quarterback, right? Like right now, no matter what you do, he is struggling and he can't make rudimentary throws right now. And good on the Jets for saying, look, and we've all been there, right? Like in my college existence, my last year, the guy was conference player of the year. And it was one of those, you get in the huddle and you're like, and his name was Dustin. You're like, Dustin's going to lead us to a touchdown here and we're going to be fine. There's an aspect of that where my first couple years where we won one game in 2 years, my first 2 years in college, it was 18 things have to go right for this guy to get us to the end zone. And it's just, there's just such a dejection there where football is a consummate team game where you have to do so many things right, but the quarterback has to complete the pass, right? And the quarterback has to do all these things, and it's frustrating. So good on the Jets for making a move. Hopefully Wilson can turn his career around. But as you said, there are intangible ththings. And I was somebody who liked Wilson's data coming out of BYU, but there are intangible things that when it's just like when it is when you see it. And I think with Wilson right now, it's not there. So good on them for moving on.
Can I say one thing?
Go ahead.
Very, very last thing. Our teammate and good buddy, Paul Saban. I know it's tough for you, Dr. Saban, but we need your insight on this if you're listening today on how you're going to correct your BYU buddy there and try to figure it out with the Jets. I'll be interested if you could chime in one day, even on the comments here. But anyway, he's obviously very much behind him.
Yeah, for sure. And I liked him. I mean, I thought that he had really good arm strength. I also, when you adjust for who he was throwing to, like he wasn't throwing to NFL caliber talent. I know Dax Milne is now playing for Washington, who we'll talk about in a second, but he wasn't like exactly playing with amazing players. Like I think there was something there, but the mental aspect of it, I always tell this story. It's like I was terrible mentally, but when you're a 6'3", 200-pound high school wide receiver, like you can overcome it. When everybody is that size, it's hard to overcome the stuff that's in your mental stuff. So when you're a college football player who's as talented as him, you can overcome some of the things that are going to drag you down when you're in the NFL, when everybody has similar talent level.
One last point. I know we want to move on. I ask you right now, do you remember a quarterback named Jeff George?
Yes.
I'm sure you probably do. Massive gun, requisite traits. There was one thing that wasn't thriving there, and I think you really, really have to hone in on that. I mean, there are quarterbacks in the past that you could touch on, say that their leadership was at a 5 out of 10. 5's not good enough, meaning right in the middle, 6. Man, when you're pulling that tag off the board, you are praying to God that guy's leadership is at the 8+, because that's what's going to pull you through a lot of these really tough times.
And Jeff George, for the younger viewers, Jeff George was the first overall pick in the 1990 draft by the Indianapolis Colts in a weird turnabout. It was a trade where the Colts gave up Chris Hinton, Andre Rison, and a number of draft picks who were all good players. And George went to Indianapolis because that was where he's from. They felt like they had to surround him with some like his past to overcome some of those deficiencies between his ears. He ended up getting traded to Atlanta, back to Atlanta, playing with Andre Rison and Chris Hinton, and actually was okay stats wise. But the biggest tell for me that George didn't have it was he went to Minnesota in 1999, was the backup to Randall Cunningham. Cunningham struggled. This was the year after the Vikings went 15-1 and made the NFC title game. He comes in and had the second best statistical season in the NFL that year. And Dennis Green, one of the best coaches in the league at the time, said, we still have to move on from him. He's not good enough. And they went with Dante Culpepper, who ultimately was a very good quarterback. But it's just a really good example of, again, you can fake it for a while, but you can't fake it forever. And you can't fool everybody when you don't have that leadership at the QB position. And that was always a ding on George. And sometimes it's hard, for somebody like me to imply that, but there's data over time that I think, folks can glean into. Speaking of leadership, okay, Ron Rivera for 3 straight years in Washington has struggled out of the gate. So you're talking about He had a 1-4 start this year. I believe it was a 2-5 start last year. The year where they won the NFC East at 7-9, it was like a 1-6 start. And then every single year, there's kind of a weaker quarterback that plays for them. Alex Smith in 2020, Taylor Heineke the last 2 years, that gets them back to about 500. Is that a frustrating thing when you're a general manager and you get all the hay in the barn, right? And the team always sort of starts out weaker, only to play well, right? They come true on their promise in the middle of the season, but expectations are so low because of how they start. What kind of culture does that build?
So that's an interesting thing. I think you saw that stat this year with the Ravens and how unbelievable they were in the preseason. Everyone thinks the preseason, who cares? We don't want to get our players injured. The tone that the preseason sets for a team is really important. Doesn't mean you always have to win. I get it. You really would like to come out ideally being right down the middle so that everyone's believing. Okay, so with Atlanta, we got into a run with that. And you know how I feel about Q, man. Dan Quinn is a hell of a football coach. Unfortunately, our preseasons always started off, we were ones or zeros in the win column. And it gets ingrained in the mind, right? Trends start surfacing, people start talking about them, and then it takes you a while to build up. So let's switch back to Washington. I know that group is really aware of what you're referencing here. And that gets in their minds, and they start wondering, and they start searching, and they start looking. And with that sort of clawing for reasoning within a building, there starts to be some distractions. There starts to be a little bit of this. That's what you have to be very careful on. You can recover. To me, it's always been, I don't know how people believe, what they believe about this or feel about this. When you're kind of the behind guy, gal trying to catch up, it's a lot easier to play with your what do you call it? Something on fire, right? Just because you're not, the pressure's not on you. They're not, big expectations aren't that way. To get back up into the middle is easy. It's going past that, of course, that becomes more difficult. So I'm sure Ron has a really good grasp of what's going on here. And I'm sure it's frustrating the hell out of him, because this can start going to a spot where people start pointing. And if they start tailing off again and they end up right around that 500 spot, where do you go? Look what they're dealing with. I mean, they bring in another quarterback this year. I don't know if you want to segue into Carson Wentz, but I mean, that is a big deal right now. All of this, including where they are with the quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. To bring a sports analogy, like if you're a cornerback, the goal is to be in such great position where you don't have to knock the ball away. If the ball's in the air, you've already lost. And so, it doesn't make, it makes you look great to dive and knock the ball away, but you were already losing by virtue of being targeted. And I think that's kind of an analogy here with them. They get behind, and we're all like praising them. Last year, they get back to 6-6, and it's like, but you had to use so much capital, yes, emotionally and all that kind of stuff just to get back. And then you don't have enough for down the stretch. Or in the case last year, they just had COVID and they just had, all these things that hurt them. In the year prior, it was, the late Dwayne Haskins, like he didn't have, and Alex Smith, the poor guy, had like an erector set in his leg. So when he goes 5-1 as a starter, he doesn't have it left in his leg to he couldn't even start the playoff game because he just didn't have it physically left. Right. So, whereas, some of these stronger teams, the Eagles and the Cowboys and they're going to sit their guys down in the second half of the year because they don't need every single game like it's life or death, the same way that Washington will, fighting and clawing for a playoff spot. I do think it's interesting. Taylor Heineke, not a great quarterback, but it is very clear that for what it's worth, he can lead that team and he can be somebody that they rally behind. And I do think that there's some value, and you see it even a little bit right now in Kirk Cousins in Minnesota, where, everybody knows Kirk is kind of not the greatest quarterback in the world, but every time they win, you can see the team trying to lift him up with the videos and all this stuff. Like, there are quarterbacks, and if you're a quarterback who's not the best quarterback in the world, you want to be that guy that the rest of your team roots for. And to me, I think that's who Taylor Heineke is. And I think even though he's clearly not the long-term answer, they themselves went out and got Carson Wentz as opposed to starting him again. I think that at least, for him, he's a guy that if you're going to sign as a backup, and Jacoby Brissett feels like the same. I think Jacoby Brissett's made himself $30 million this year. just by how he's played now. He's been a gamer this year for the Cleveland Browns. I think he really, I think guys like that are guys you can win with in the short term.
Eric, did you refer just on, was it emotional equity? Is that what you said?
Yeah, like an emotion. Yeah, just emotional equity that you have to. I mean, you only have so much, right?
If I can comment on that through some of the seasons that we were up and down in the years that I was in that seat, it is enervating, brother. You try to make it look like everything is fine, but there's a lot on your plate when you're trying to catch up. And not only 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, when there's a trend of it, not to beat it to death, it is something that all of us with wanting to have that sort of analytic mind, like, well, but look what they're doing here. Look at how they're bridging the gap. But there is drain, and that building feels that drain when they're always trying to catch up instead of getting their asses out the gate strong, setting a tone, being, just having that presence about them. You have the owner on your side, because believe me, owners are very, very particular about that. They know the trends. May not be necessarily their finance guy in their other businesses. It may be their sons who are really dialed into PFF and saying, hey, Dad, there's something wrong with our football team. That's a little bit of tongue in cheek, of course, but it happens.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, there was somebody in the league who I'm really good friends with, who last season I was just like, well, how's it going? Like, and this is a team that's won before. And you said, right now every win's a relief, and I think that I could feel that in your face, right? Where you when I said that, it's like there are some years where wins are just relief, right? And for example, I think with the Jets, they just want to get to back where winning's fun again, right? And that does matter. And I think that there are aspects where you just don't, you want to pace yourself in this league and be in a certain way. And like you think about the Rams, where they lose 3 games in a row last year, everybody sort of writes them off. They lose to the Niners in the last game of the season. And it's like, okay, good. Like no one expects anything out of us. Let's use that sort of, as you said, come from behind mentality to go and get a Super Bowl win. All right. One more question before we get to listener questions, or one more topic. Mm-hmm. There was a great piece by Mike Sando in The Athletic last year where it talked about kind of why teams are trading first-round picks for veterans more now. And he went through, and I think you can feel this as much as anybody, having picked in the back half of the first round. Like the fifth-year option rates are pretty steady and pretty high for the top 10 to 15 picks. Early in the 2011 CBA, they were pretty good too for the back half of the first round, so 16 through 32. Over the last half a decade or so, those rates have fallen precipitously. So if you're a draft pick taken in the bottom half of the first round or bottom third, you're more likely to have your fifth-year option declined than you are to have it exercised. And so his point was teams that are good should be trading those picks for veterans because they know what they're getting out of the veterans, and it's too much of a risk for those first rounders. All makes sense. However, what we have now, though, is of the top 10 picks in next year's draft, 4 of them are not owned by their original team. And those picks, so you have the Saints who traded their pick to the Eagles, the Browns who traded their pick to Houston, the Rams who traded their pick to the Lions in the Stafford trade. Again, flags fly forever. That'll be fine. And then the Broncos who traded their pick to the Seahawks. I think all 4 of those teams believed when they traded those picks that those picks would be bottom half of the first round picks. And now they're huge assets that are now going to a different team. Is that the other side of the story? Is that if you go all in, and we talked about the Vikings last week too, and you better win because it can get desolate after. Is that the other side of using these high-end cheap draft picks to get veteran players? Is that if it doesn't work out, it's going to be so much worse than if you go into the draft and the draft doesn't work out?
Look, I would like to start off by talking about our Maverick quarterback or Maverick GM friend out in LA, in Les Snead, and his F them picks theory, or whatever we're going to call it. Might be the F them picks model. The idea, and he and I had a long talk about this, and there's merit to it. The uncertainty about picking in the first round, I want to go here for a minute, is really, really interesting when you study it. And as a GM and a head coach, as co-team builders, and you start looking at it, and you know what you're getting in those potential veteran acquisitions and the trades and trading away those picks, right? Les had said to me, like, that's a big thing. Knowing what you're getting versus projecting is a little unsettling at times, especially if, again, things need to go in a certain direction like they do in the NFL. I would just say, remember how important that is, even to a point of it may be a guy that has a character issue, but what his character issue is. Mm-hmm. And that he might fall asleep in the meetings. Don't fight that. Bring his ass in there. Get him to get X amount of sacks or interceptions. If he falls asleep, don't piss and moan about it. Accept it because his, the strong suit and the challenges. But in the end, he's going to play his butt off and he's going to help you win and hopefully get to the Super Bowl. It's an interesting lead in. I might toss it back to you on that to ask your question or expound on your question to me.
Yeah, it's like I'm always going to prize the young cheap talent. We have a good question in the chat about like what to do when you hit on young cheap talent, which is a good question. But I think that there's a middle ground, right? I think like for somebody like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who was on a rookie contract, actually in Miami, it wasn't clear that he was that good yet, but maybe if you have a good, because like the big thing is the uncertainty associated with draft picks is whether or not the college to pro projection is good, right? Which is a huge set of uncertainty. Now, you're paying almost nothing for it relative to what you would with a veteran like a Jalen Ramsey. The question about whether Jalen Ramsey can go from college to pro has been solved already, right? But you are paying for that uncertainty. The thing that you're paying for, the thing that you're making a bet on, which I think, again, it's expensive. You're betting on health and you're betting on fit and you're betting on like him improving even more. I think those bets are more likely to hit. It's just a question of whether or not that cost is palatable for you as a team. And, like in the case of Orlando Brown with the Chiefs, like they needed a left tackle. That where they were drafting last year was hollow in terms of left tackles. So you trade the equivalent of like the 40th pick for 2 years of okay left tackle play, and then you can let him go and get a comp pick. That seems like a reasonable risk. When you trade 2 first-rounders and a second for Frank Clark, a guy who's, up and down, right, as an NFL player, then the question is he going to live up to that billing and including a $100 million contract? Like, I think that's the risk that everybody's like, well, no, he's a sure thing. It's like, well, and this is our point at SumerSports is quantify how sure of a thing it is, quantify whether you're making a good gamble, and then, make that gamble and whether or not it's going to matter. Because for every Jalen Ramsey, there's a Jamal Adams. And for every Von Miller or Khalil Mack, let's go with, for every Khalil Mack, there's a Frank Clark. And you don't want to bat 500 on those picks. You can bat 500 in the draft and do okay. You can't bat 500 on veteran trades and win.
So awesome points. I love listening to that. Another thing I think that is really important to talk about here is when you're trading away first round picks as a general manager, let's put aside the coaching team builder aside for a minute. That's hanging over your head, man. I mean, your job is to acquire, hopefully through the draft and supplement with free agency. That's kind of our tagline, as most general managers would say. It's changed, of course. There's a lot of pressure. What I want our listeners to know that it is not, yes, it may be ultimately on the GM to make that decision, but you have an owner in your ear, you have a head coach in your ear, you have a coaching staff and a personnel staff. Do it. Could be, right? Let's move it. We'll make it up. We'll do this. Everyone has a plan. Everyone signed off on it. You sign off on it. And as quickly as you sign off on it and all the darts start throwing towards you as a GM, everyone starts to sit back in their seats a little bit. Everyone from the top down. It's the GM's deal, man. So it's a funky ride, right? And through that, I always like to say that's where you have to be the piece of driftwood, because you're gonna have a lot of arrows, shot your way. In the end, if it settles in and you win, great. If you don't, adds to the hot seat, adds to the ticking of the clock. It's the reality.
Yeah, and there's also the aspect of trading future picks. They may not be your picks, and there's a part of where I find Ryan Poles, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, guys who have just started, trading, going back, right, and getting picks for players that are not going to help them today. Like there is, and I also think that's, if folks are just more honest, that's where I find Les Snead, even though I don't necessarily agree with his team building sometimes, I find him refreshing because he's very explicit about what he's trying to do, which is the Super Bowl's in Los Angeles. We have a great quarterback, a Hall of Fame head coach, a generational defensive tackle in Aaron Donald, and a weak NFC. What are we doing here, boys? Let's go ahead and win a Super Bowl. To me, that's okay. Like it's sort of the rudderless ones where you're just like, well, what, and same with Ryan Poles. Like I love what Ryan Poles is doing. I love the fact that he's like, look, this year is for evaluating my players, right? And so if I already know that what Robert Quinn is in the NFL, I'd love for him to come back, but for right now I can get a 4th round pick for him. We love you. See you later. Like that's, to me, as long as there is an understanding of time frame and what these picks mean, because a 1st round pick in 2025 means very little to somebody who's on the hot seat. A 1st round pick in 2025 might mean a lot to Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, where once his plan's in place and he wakes up one day in 2025 and he has this pick, it's like, oh my goodness, now we can make a strength of strength, right? And so I think that's important too, and is such a huge aspect that I think is missed sometimes. For example, when the Panthers turned down reportedly 2 1st round picks that were later on for Brian Burns, it's like, well, if you're the general manager of the Panthers and they just fired the head coach, like how do, like, I think it's silly to bag on a guy for not wanting to get a 1st round pick that he might just have to give to another general manager someday. Like I think that context matters.
Context matters. This kind of brings back to respectfully suggesting that the owners play a big part in how you navigate through this, meaning it depends what that owner is saying. If that owner is a here and now 1 and 2 year guy, let's roll. As a GM, even if you come from a Patriot paradigm, you're going to have to adhere to the man whose train set it is, meaning we're going now. If the owner is very explicit about new GM and head coach, or new GM specifically, you have 5 years. I'm giving you 5 legit years here. You have my word on it. Of course, that can change. Then you're going to have a different approach to how a different theory and philosophy on how you approach building your team. That's when behind closed doors, you can talk about all you want. But if your owner's pressing you to win now, acquire now, do as much as we can to bring a Super Bowl to this city, there is a little bit of that. The outside doesn't really know that, Eric. And the outside could throw, again, I hate saying throw darts, but they can be critical. But the reality is, there is at the very core of every organization, there is a philosophy and approach for the most part, unless an owner gives full keys to the kingdom, which very quickly leads me over to John Robinson. We're going to move on from here and how they can do it with the Titans. John has a coveted spot there because he has been given the proverbial keys to the kingdom to do what he needs to do.
Yeah. And winning really helps, and winning multiple different ways for them really helps, right? Like they were the one that moved on from Mariota and got a new quarterback, have worked around that new quarterback. They're a team that bought into Bud Dupree, and they're a team that bought into, and they've won. They've won because of a lot of things, despite a lot of things. And, he's earned the opportunity now as, they were able to trade AJ Brown for what essentially was Treylon Burks and the cap space for AJ Brown. And I don't think that many people looked at them and said, "Oh, what an idiot," because he's earned when you're the 1 seed in an AFC that includes Patrick Mahomes' Chiefs, Josh Allen's Bills, Joe Burrow's Bengals, Justin Herbert's Chargers, you get a little bit of leeway, right? The same way that, for you, when you had 5 straight winning seasons to start your GM career, you had, when you made the Julio Jones trade, there were detractors. But there were also, you could also look up and say, hey, scoreboard, right? I've won here. Like, give me a break and let me see this thing out. There are, there is just, privileges that are afforded people who have had success. And there are desperations that folks who have not yet had success, even if they're good, have to go through. And that's just life. And that's life in every single aspect of life.
Hey, you just saw that comment there before we move on about Vrabel doesn't get enough credit by Mojal. Is that the fellow's name?
Yeah.
I agree. Remember, John Robinson and Mike Vrabel both come from the Patriot paradigm. They have a really keen awareness of each other, not always in sync, of course. You can't be a Belichickian offspring again, so to speak, and not be able to banter, because you have to be able to do that. And I think both of those men have a really good feel. So it's a great point on Vrabel and how that team is developing.
Yeah, let's get to listener questions. I want to get to one first because this guy is one of our great people at SumerSports. He's also just had a new child. Pavel, congratulations, buddy. He writes Pavel_Vob if you want to follow a guy who has great insights on Twitter and certainly a pleasure to work with here. Longtime listener, first-time caller. What should the Giants do with Daniel Jones this offseason? They refused his fifth-year option. We just talked about that. But he's played admirably in Daboll's offense. I think it's a great question because you could grade Daniel Jones on a number of different curves this year. And I think Pavel's assessment that he's been admirable is fairly is reasonable.
He's right in the middle of the pack, though, or 18, 19. Where is he as far as his
It
ratings
depends.
right
So if
now?
you look at QBR, he's in like the top half of the league. But QBR factors in it, and our colleague Paul Saban, built it. It factors in a lot of running, which Daniel Jones is adding a ton of value with his legs. He's not the greatest at not being sacked. He's actually not turning it over as much, which is good. But yeah, depending upon the metric, he's anywhere from like 12 to 20 this year. And I think the real question is Thomas, have you seen during this new CBA a quarterback contract that is in that realm? Like, there isn't really a middle-class quarterback contract, is there?
It doesn't feel like there is. And to get back to that Pavel's question for a minute, and by the way, Pavel is one of the most intelligent people that we've been around. I know we have massive intelligence along with yourself there, not to stroke you live there, buddy, but Pavel is just on the dial. It's great to be around guys like that to get your mind going in a certain way, from a football perspective. So this question to me, I know there are many layers for Pavel. Let me just say first, before I go to the contract idea, Brian Daboll and what he does and how he approaches a game and his football mind and his offensive mind is only going to get the most out of a player like Daniel Jones, right? And some of the other players. And I personally think you really have to take inventory through the entire season here. Of course, you might put them up in a certain spot on your board right now, but it's all about looking at the entire picture here before you decide, are we going in another direction? Do we need to invest in another quarterback? Can we hang with him? What's the competition like next year? Do we bring someone else in to go toe-to-toe with Daniel Jones? All these questions will come out along with Brian Daboll and where management is and where they want to be and how they want to approach it. It's a big decision back to quarterbacks. I personally think they're going to stay with him and get the most out of him as they can, contract wise. Where is that midline quarterback contract right now, according to your data, Eric?
Yeah, it's probably something like $15 million a year. The problem is like you just don't get that. The best example I could always give is in 2020, Joe Burrow was the top pick in the draft, and his APY was $10 million. The next highest paid quarterback that was starting in the league was Teddy Bridgewater at 20. So there was a $10 million gap between the rookie contract quarterbacks and the lowest veteran contract. And so, like, for me, I think it's probably somewhere in that 15 to 20 range. I guess the question is do you play you play with risk on both sides of that negotiation, right? The first risk is that he doesn't play well and you have a roster, Evan Neal, Andrew Thomas, Saquon Barkley, who also has to get a contract. Some of these other guys that are playing really, Leonard Williams, Azeez Ojulari, Kayvon Thibodeau. Like, you have good players on the team. And much like with Bortles was kind of the middle class contract when he did it. much like with the Jags, if he bottoms out, then that whole roster, you think about how good that Jags defense was, goes down with it. So that's one risk. The other risk is what I call the Kirk Cousins risk, which is if he continues to play that well, right, then he eventually prices himself out of your market, much like what Kirk Cousins did with Washington when they give him the franchise tag, and then he kept playing to that standard, but not to a standard that they wanted to give him the max deal, but just good enough where somebody was going to. And then you invest another year in the quarterback and he's gone for a different reason. Like, that's where I get worried, and maybe why there's no such thing as a middle-class quarterback contract. The teams are either going to be like, look, we're going to cut bait, or we're going to say we're going to give you the max deal and work and live with that. And I think that Jones could be an exception, but it's really hard to see what that looks like.
So Joe Shane, the new general manager, and again Brian Daboll, new to the party. Again, both good football people. They're going to be working together. Joe Shane has been given final football say. That for the listeners is really interesting as well. If he and Brian are on the same wavelength, great. And I assume that they would be stepping in year one because there is no pressure whatsoever on them. They didn't make the pick, right? Just like when Mike Smith and I came in Atlanta in 2008, and we had to pick Matt Ryan after Michael Vick. That pressure of Michael Vick was not on us at all. I know it's not similar, of course, but it's a big decision, right? How do you replace? So what I'd say, just very quickly back to Joe Shane and Brian Daboll, team building together, not a lot of pressure. Let's see how it plays out. Let's come back together. Let's knock on our owners and the big man's door in John Mara and say, John, are you all right with us moving on here or not? Get the final check off as you have to. Just remember, final football say is great, and it goes to either the head coach or the GM. It's probably half or three quarters to the GM right now in the league. But you need sign off from your owners. Again, their train set.
Yeah, that's such great insight there. Okay, so let's look a little bit here as well. So Amy Bright, who has been, this is a comment that we got on the YouTube. She says, can you guys do an in-depth kind of breakdown into what the Broncos are kind of going through right now, right? Like, should they move on from Hackett? Should they move on from the big three and start over? GM, quarterback, head coach. We're not going to say people should be fired. Like, that's not part of this show. We're just going to give an assessment of like what the decision space looks like here. But we really do appreciate this question from Amy here. The Broncos are in a really tough spot, right? Because, you've put so much capital into Wilson. Realistically, unless somebody wants to trade for him, he's your quarterback for a while, which again is part of the risk that we talk about with the Daniel Jones thing, where you give him the max and then, that's the downside risk. The head coach with Hackett, first-year head coach, but hired by different ownership. And then a GM in George Payton, who I think for the most part has acquired some really good players for that team. But obviously with the biggest decision, as you said earlier in the show, it's come up snake eyes a little bit with Wilson. So what do we think about as far as, the Broncos and what they're up against in a division where they have won a Super Bowl more recently than they've beaten the Chiefs?
So I'm going to lead in on a funny little phrase that a lot of us GMs know in certain terms refer to it as a contract's puke point. And yes, you heard that, puke point. There is a point within that contract that you're going to throw up. Once you get past that puke point, you're a little more comfortable with making moves and adjusting. That's a long, long journey there with Russell, of course. So they have to really figure out how they can manage it, get everything. In my mind, make sure you surround Russell Wilson continue with the right talent, maybe adjust schemes, get him to understand what needs to be adjusted, right? That's an important part because he has a big confidence element to him. He's got a big ego like every quarterback, but he knows how he wants it. He has his own office in that building. Remember, everyone, he is a strong stakeholder there. Now with a new ownership, back to being complicated, you have a new ownership. Huge money, of course. They're willing to do what they need to do, but they don't have a background in this business. So they're going to be tapping into potentially the Mannings. John Elway, even though he's kind of stepped aside, will be there for them, I'm sure, to offer his insight. George Payton George Paton knows what he's doing. Again, George Paton has been around this business a long time, and George has made big time moves that are going to be scrutinized just like I did, like any GM is. He needs to keep, respectfully, and I'm not telling him what to do, but he needs to keep a really, really, zoom focus on where he is and not get swayed by all of the outside, criticisms or suggestions. And he needs to truly look at it and talk to the new owners about, here is exactly what we think needs to be done. Because his loyalty, as much as anyone wants to think about it, and I know if there are any former head coaches, there's a lot of them that I love. We have great relationships. They don't want to hear this. The loyalty is not to their coach Hackett. His loyalty, George Paton, is to this ownership group. He needs to do what's right. And remember, you get 2 coaches in this league, potentially 2 quarterbacks in this league as a general manager. Otherwise, you're hanging off by the edge of a cliff.
Yeah, Peyton has some things he can go back to. Obviously, with Minnesota, I think he and Spielman drafted conservatively about 5 or 6 players who are borderline Hall of Famers. So he's clearly done something right. And in fact, after he left Minnesota for Denver, things went poorly in Minnesota. So I think he's from the and look, if you want to consult with if you want more of that insight, obviously SumerSports, we're digging into a lot of this stuff. Like, if you look at some key performance indicators, George Paton it has the goods to be a good general manager. I think the big thing with Wilson, and this is to me how you get out of this, the first game of the season when Wilson threw the coach under the bus for the timeout usage, to me, that has to be a conversation, because if you're the quarterback, you are management. And you even, in the case of Wilson, even have your own office. So you take the timeouts, right? You run the offense. And I think what the Broncos, the one miscalculation was how good Wilson was in Seattle. I think they underestimated how good Pete Carroll was. And I think we all did. I did for one. And I think, the conversation that has to be had with Russell Wilson is, look, the physical stuff, it looks like your arm, you need some surgery, you need something there. But from a leadership standpoint, that's really where the stepping up has to happen in this year. And it's just like little quotes like that where, it's just little quotes like that where I think that they have to be partners in this come up over the next 6 months to 12 months.
You had a quick softball there before we go on. You said that George Paton is a good GM, right? Which we always say at SumerSports with our cutting edge algorithm that we're working on. We feel strongly that we're going to take the good GM to being a very good GM and the very good GM to being a Hall of Fame GM. That's how strongly we feel. And I'm not putting us out there, Eric, but that idea of being able to take analytics appropriately, the proper algorithmic approach, and supplement is going to be a really important part of the evolution of our league that we've talked about many times.
Yeah, for sure. So we're running up on time here. Let's get one more question, which I really like this one. This is from Disappointed Vrabel on Twitter, which is a kind of a cool handle, Who's5. And again, for everybody that came, we really appreciate you. We can't get to every question, but we can get to a few. Jimmy Garoppolo has had a great year and executes at a high level, but also benefits clearly from a healthy Kittle, a top 10 graded Brandon Ayuk, an elite check down with Christian McCaffrey. How does a GM, in-house or observing from the outside, evaluate a player like Jimmy G? Is it wrong to take some of the team level stats like expected points added or yards per play, where he clearly looks as good as some of the elite quarterbacks? How does an evaluator untangle those things, right? Because I think Jimmy G is a really good Rorschach test for sort of like understanding the QB position.
Years ago, it was about getting a quarterback that you could navigate with. You could have some midline years, you could have some good years, you could have some down years, and it played out like in the end, you're a good, solid football team and you're respected around the NFL. Today is about winning the Super Bowl. It is not for long, as we've mentioned many, many times. In the end, all these beautiful stats, good-looking guy, everything about him, and he's a wonderful person, as I understand from the people there and at New England. That's beside the point. We're talking business here. The business is when it comes down to end cutting time, what happens? Does he win it? Does he make the big play? Does he help you win the Super Bowl at that crunch time? I would say that about anyone. Look, people could throw a dart at me on that with Matt Ryan. Did Matt do it in 16? No, he was an MVP of the entire, league that year. But in the end, we step back as GMs and owners and say, can this person finish the play, finish the game, and win us a Super Bowl? That's up for debate, of course.
Yeah, and I think, as somebody who I've only attended one Super Bowl in my life, and it was Chiefs Niners, and you look at Jimmy G and you certainly respect him, but you don't fear him. Maybe that's a way I think to to sort of get around it. But I think he can certainly execute that offense. I've always, and I don't know, I think he's the Ron Burgundy of quarterbacks. I think he throws what's on the teleprompter and he does it really well. But that is what causes interceptions too, because sometimes there's a linebacker right where he's supposed to throw it, and he throws it right to that linebacker. And so you see the limitations there, but he certainly can execute. And I think that's what puts him, in my estimation, in the top half of the league. But to your point, to win a Super Bowl when things aren't perfect, you need a top 5 quarterback. And so that's such a hard, such a hard eval, because we're all chasing that when in reality, Jimmy G will probably take you to the playoffs more often than not. So,
well, think about that too, before we go. I know you got to go. John Lynch, Kyle Shanahan. I mean, through and through football guys who know every nuance from, coach and GM perspective, former player, Hall of Famer. They know that. They know this is about the person that needs to pull them through. Yeah. Where they are with their young quarterback compared to Garoppolo. Can you imagine going through that in the last year, trying to decide on that?
I mean, I think before we let you get to the airport here, I do think this is a great question, because and this is a testament to our great listeners who are asking great questions, because I think that this is the second one. Do you sometimes put yourself in that position with a contract? Because I know with Jimmy G, they wanted to trade him, and I think for a long, Washington wanted him, but then his arm was messed up, and then eventually everybody did the musical chairs, and Jimmy G was the one standing. Mm-hmm. And you get to week 1, and then they just give him a contract to be the best backup in football, but they put a lot of outs in the contract for Jimmy G. Namely, they can't franchise tag Jimmy G. So if Garoppolo is going to be the Niners quarterback next year, he's going to be making the max deal because of all the stuff that they put in the contract. Do you find that that's a good way for you as a GM to make the decision before it happens? Because ultimately, whatever the Niners do this year, it's going to be less dependent upon Jimmy G and more dependent on everything else. You drafted Trey Lance because you felt like you needed to put a better quarterback in that spot to win you a Super Bowl. So if Jimmy G has a good run of luck here or a good run of play, you don't want to be mesmerized or drunken by that, right? So does putting things in contracts like that, like the no trade and the no, they basically ensure that he's going to hit free agency after this year, and he can make his own choice of what we're to play. Is doing that a smart move for the 49ers?
I believe it's a smart move. I believe there are myriad levels to this discussion and this sort of idea of which quarterback are we going to go with, how much can we gain from making that move, with Jimmy before they decided not to. I mean, I'm just telling you, you don't think that is a massive amount of discussion and effort. And I'm sure it could be heated. Let's take it away from the 49ers, because I don't want to be specific to them. Anyone who has a quarterback situation, any similarities to that, day in, day out, there is always discussion. And when you agree upon it as a head coach and a GM, that's great. The next day you might not, because the quarterback might throw a stupid ass interception or something goes on. And then all of a sudden the coach stomps in pissed off, and the GM's like, we just agreed that he was the guy we were going with last week. There's this mercurial side of team building that everyone really needs to get their head around. It's not cut and dry. Different levels, different nuances. And then, oh, by the way, you get an owner sometimes in your ear calling you one night late because he's agitated with it, might adjust you. You come back in the morning and you deliver a message to the head coach saying, hey, man, we should approach this. And that head coach might look at you and think, where did that change? It's just a really interesting back and forth discussion.
Well, I think very similar to how, like some of us, like with our workout gear, make sure that you can't watch Netflix unless the rowing machine is on or something like that. Like, I do think that there are these great nudges, right? Where I won't allow myself to do something unless this happens. I think building in safeguards for yourself in decision making, right? In September, everybody probably agreed to that Jimmy G deal, right? Because it was inconsequential. Trey Lance was going to start. So, of course, we want to build in all this stuff, this nice stuff to make sure that Jimmy G can get what he wants after he serves as our backup this year. Now it's a little bit messier, right? You might have the coach wanting him to stay, but you've already agreed to all these things that'll make the decision easier in the future. I like that, actually. I really do like that. It's a nudge. It's something that, again, as we both manage people, right? There's things that you have to do to manage people properly. And sometimes there are these little tricks that help people do the right thing, even though, it's by limiting decision-making opportunities, which is kind of weird, but I think that sometimes it can be effective there. So really cool discussion there. And I think, I think the Jimmy G thing is a really interesting topic and a fun one there. So, awesome. Well, this was fun, Thomas. I really hope you enjoy Thanksgiving. I hope you enjoy the slopes. I gotta say, I called you yesterday. You were long gone. I texted Sean. I was like, "Where's Thomas?" He goes, "Man, that guy's long gone. He's on the slopes today. You're probably not going to get a hold of him." So I'm hoping that you really enjoyed your time skiing and all that good stuff, and time watching football tomorrow. As we approach the holiday. Thank you to all of you that joined us today, either on Twitter or on YouTube, or things like LinkedIn and Facebook. You can also find us there as well. We really appreciate all of you, and we're hoping to continue to grow this and continue as we move forward with this podcast to continue to give you value each and every week. So for Thomas Dimitroff, I'm Eric Eager. This has been episode 8 of the SumerSports Show. Thanks for joining us.